Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The time is 3 p.m. The date is November 1st, 2006. The place is the Pine Bar, inside the opulent Millennium Hotel in London's Mayfair district. It's a room of dark wood, plush leather, and the hushed, clinking sounds of afternoon business. Two men sit at a table, waiting. A third man, Alexander Litvinenko, arrives. He is 43 years old, with a lean face, thinning hair, and the watchful eyes of a man who has spent his life seeing things he wasn't supposed to see. He greets the two men, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, fellow Russians with shared histories in the shadowy world of state security. They talk business, old times, mutual acquaintances. A pot of green tea is on the table. A cup is poured for him. He takes a few sips. The meeting is brief, unremarkable. He leaves feeling fine. He has no way of knowing that he has just ingested his own death. He has no way of knowing that inside his body, a silent, furious storm has begun. The substance in the tea was not a chemical. It was not a biological agent. It was an element, forged in the heart of a nuclear reactor. A microscopic, undetectable speck of polonium-210, a rare radioactive isotope that emits a lethal barrage of alpha particles. It is the perfect poison for a ghost, an assassin who leaves no trace. Within hours, it would begin its work, shredding the DNA in his cells, silencing his bone marrow, and dissolving his organs from the inside out. The story of Alexander Litvinenko is not just the story of a murder. It is a story about the far-reaching power of the state, the brutal price of dissent, and the dawn of a new, terrifying form of state-sponsored terror. It is a modern espionage thriller played out in real time on the streets of one of the world's great capitals. And to understand it, we must dissect the anatomy of a nuclear assassination. We will trace the invisible trail of a substance 1,000,000 times more toxic than cyanide, following it from a single porcelain teacup, through the sterile corridors of a London hospital, across the skies of Europe, and into the very heart of the Russian state. We will explore how investigators, faced with a weapon they had never before encountered in a criminal case, pioneered a forensic strategy to unmask killers who believed they were untouchable. This is the anatomy of a perfect crime, undone by the very ghost it was designed to create. To understand why a man would be killed with a substance so exotic and so brutal, you must first understand the man himself. Alexander Valterovich Litvinenko, known to his friends as Sasha, was not born a dissident. He was born a product of the Soviet system, destined to be one of its enforcers. Born in 1962 in the city of Voronezh, he was the son of a doctor and the grandson of a man who served in the NKVD, the dreaded precursor to the KGB. He was steeped in the culture of the state. He followed a well-worn path for ambitious young men, joining the internal troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs after high school. By 1988, he had been recruited into the KGB, the sword and shield of the Soviet Union. He was, by all accounts, a capable and dedicated officer, specializing in counter-terrorism and organized crime. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Litvinenko's world, like that of so many of his colleagues, was thrown into chaos. The KGB was dismantled and rebranded, eventually becoming the FSB, the Federal Security Service. But its core mission and many of its personnel remained. Litvinenko stayed on, rising through the ranks of the new organization. His disillusionment was not a sudden event, but a slow burn. He was a frontline officer in the brutal First Chechen War, an experience that exposed him to the raw corruption and moral decay that he felt was rotting the Russian state from within. He saw the lines blur between the criminals he was supposed to be fighting and the officials he was supposed to be serving. He came to believe that the security services, the very institution he had dedicated his life to, had become a criminal enterprise in its own right, a tool for political repression and personal enrichment. The breaking point came in 1998. Litvinenko, then a lieutenant colonel in a prestigious FSB unit, was allegedly given a shocking order to assassinate Boris Berezovsky, a powerful oligarch who had fallen out of favor with the Kremlin's inner circle. The command was, for Litvinenko, a line he could not cross. He refused, but he didn't just refuse, he went public. In November of 1998, Litvinenko and 4 of his masked colleagues held a televised press conference in Moscow. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. He sat before the world's media and accused his superiors at the FSB of ordering assassinations, of engaging in kidnapping, and of running the agency like a mafia clan. He was immediately fired, arrested on trumped-up charges, and thrown into Lefortovo prison, the FSB's notorious detention center. He was eventually acquitted, but immediately rearrested on new charges. It was a clear message. The system does not tolerate traitors. After a second acquittal, and facing the certainty of a third arrest that would surely lead to a long prison sentence, Litvinenko made a decision. In 2000, with the help of Berezovsky's associates, he fled Russia, escaping via Turkey and eventually claiming political asylum in the United Kingdom. He arrived in London with his wife, Marina, and their young son, Anatoly. He was a man without a country, but he had found his voice. In London, Litvinenko became one of the Kremlin's most vocal and relentless critics. Bankrolled by his now patron, Boris Berezovsky, he co-authored a book that would seal his fate, Blowing Up Russia, Terror from Within. In it, he laid out a horrifying conspiracy theory that the 1999 Russian apartment bombings, a series of explosions that killed more than 300 people and were officially blamed on Chechen terrorists, were in fact a false flag operation orchestrated by the FSB itself. The purpose, he argued, was to create a pretext for the Second Chechen War and to sweep a little-known former FSB director named Vladimir Putin into the presidency on a wave of public fear and nationalist fervor. The accusation was explosive, a direct assault on the very legitimacy of Putin's rule. Whether the theory was true or not, in the eyes of the Kremlin, it was an unforgivable act of betrayal. Litvinenko didn't stop there. He wrote another book, The Gang from the Lubyanka, accusing the FSB of controlling the global heroin trade. He became a consultant, allegedly for Britain's MI6, using his insider knowledge to advise on Russian organized crime and security matters. He was a thorn in the side of a powerful and unforgiving regime. He was a man who knew too much and said too much. He was, in essence, a dead man walking. He just didn't know how or when his sentence would be carried out. The first day of November 2006 began like any other for Alexander Litvinenko. He was a man of routine, a creature of habit. He was now a British citizen, living a quiet life in the North London suburb of Muswell Hill. That day, his schedule was full. He had 2 key meetings in central London. The first was at a branch of the Itsu sushi restaurant on Piccadilly. He was meeting an Italian academic and security consultant named Mario Scaramella. Scaramella was an eccentric figure who claimed to have information about the murder of another Russian dissident, the investigative journalist Anna Politovskaya, who had been shot dead in her Moscow apartment building just a month earlier. Scaramella claimed to have a list of names, potential targets for assassination, and he believed Litvinenko's name was on it. He handed over documents, a warning that seemed both urgent and slightly paranoid. Litvinenko reviewed the papers, ate his lunch, and left. He felt perfectly normal. The meeting, while intriguing, seemed like just another day in the strange world of émigré politics and intelligence gossip. From Itsu, Litvinenko made his way to his second appointment, the one at the Millennium Hotel in Grosvenor Square. This was a business meeting with two men he knew from his past life. The first was Andrei Lugovoy, a former KGB and FSB officer who had once served as a bodyguard for a top Russian official. After leaving the service, Lugovoy had gone into private security and business. The second man was Dmitry Kovtun, another former Soviet military officer turned businessman. Litvinenko had known them both for years. On the surface, the meeting was about a potential business venture. Lugovoy and Kovtun wanted Litvinenko's help making corporate security introductions in London. They were old contacts, part of the loose network of former Russian security men navigating the world of international business. The meeting point was the hotel's Pine Bar. When Litvinenko arrived, Lugovoy and Kovtun were already there. A pot of green tea sat on the table. Years later, during the public inquiry into his death, CCTV footage would be meticulously analyzed. It shows Litvinenko arriving greeting the men. It shows the teapot. Litvinenko later told his wife, Marina, that he didn't order the tea. It was already there. Lugovoy insisted he drink some. Litvinenko, cautious by nature, was hesitant. He didn't like green tea, and he was wary of accepting anything from men with their backgrounds. But not wanting to appear rude or paranoid, he relented. He recalled taking just 3 or 4 sips. The tea, he said, tasted unremarkable. The conversation was brief, lasting no more than 20 minutes. They discussed business, made plans for a future meeting, and parted ways. Litvinenko left the hotel and took the tube home to Muswell Hill. He arrived around 5:30 p.m. He still felt fine. He ate dinner with his family, a meal of fried fish prepared by his wife. It was only later that evening that the first sign appeared, a wave of nausea. He began vomiting, violently and uncontrollably. The storm inside him had made landfall. Initially, he and Marina thought it was a simple case of food poisoning, perhaps from the fish he ate for dinner or the sushi he'd had for lunch. But this was no ordinary stomach bug. The vomiting was relentless, accompanied by excruciating abdominal cramps. Over the next 2 days, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He was weak, unable to keep down food or water. By November 3rd, he was so ill that Marina insisted on calling an ambulance. He was taken to his local hospital, Barnet General, in North London. The doctors in the emergency room were faced with a puzzle. Here was a fit, 43-year-old man presenting with extreme gastrointestinal distress. They ran the standard tests, blood work, scans, everything they could think of. The initial diagnosis was a severe stomach infection. But the treatments had no effect. He continued to worsen. The pain was unbearable. His white blood cell count plummeted, a sign that his immune system was collapsing. His bone marrow, the factory for his body's blood cells, was shutting down. Then came the next terrifying symptom. His thick, dark hair began to fall out in clumps. When Marina visited him in the hospital, she found his pillow covered in it. This was a telltale sign, a classic symptom of either extreme chemotherapy or something far more sinister. Radiation poisoning. Litvinenko himself, with his background in the security services, knew what this meant. From his hospital bed, weak and gaunt, he voiced his suspicion. He told his doctors and the police who came to interview him that he believed he had been poisoned, and that the order had come from the very top of the Russian government. The local police were initially skeptical. The idea of a sophisticated poisoning plot on British soil sounded like something from a spy novel. But as his condition defied all medical explanation, his claims began to gain a terrifying credibility. His organs started to fail. His liver, his kidneys, his heart. He was transferred to the intensive care unit at University College Hospital, a more specialized facility in central London. Doctors there were equally baffled. They tested for everything imaginable. Heavy metals like thallium and cesium, known poisons used by intelligence agencies in the past. The results all came back negative. They were refighting a ghost. They were treating the symptoms, the organ failure, the immune system collapse, but they had no idea what was causing the underlying disease. Alexander Litvinenko was dying, and no one knew why. As Litvinenko's body wasted away, a quiet but frantic search for answers was underway behind the scenes. The police, now taking his claims seriously, had brought in toxicologists from the Health Protection Agency. They, in turn, began to consider the unthinkable. The combination of symptoms, the gastrointestinal chaos, the bone marrow suppression, the hair loss, was a textbook presentation of acute radiation syndrome. Yet, standard hospital Geiger counters, which detect gamma radiation, showed nothing. This was the crucial part of the puzzle. If it was radiation, it was a type of radiation that was invisible to their normal equipment. The desperate search for an answer led them to one of the most secure and secretive facilities in the United Kingdom, the Atomic Weapons Establishment, or AA, at Aldermaston. This is the heart of Britain's nuclear defense program, a place staffed by some of the world's leading experts on radiological materials. A sample of Litvinenko's urine was urgently dispatched to their laboratories on November 22. The scientists at Aldermaston possessed technology far beyond that of any hospital. They used a technique called gamma-ray spectrometry, which can detect even faint energy signatures emitted by radioactive substances. Their initial tests, like the hospital's, found nothing. But one scientist, observing a tiny unexplained peak in the energy spectrum, had a hunch. The peak was faint, but it was there. This suggested the presence of something that was emitting not gamma rays, but another form of radiation entirely, alpha particles. Alpha radiation is different. It consists of 2 protons and 2 neutrons, essentially the nucleus of a helium atom. It's heavy, slow-moving, and has very little penetrating power. A single sheet of paper or the outer layer of human skin is enough to stop it. This is why it's so difficult to detect from outside the body. A Geiger counter held next to a person poisoned with an alpha emitter would register nothing. But inside the body, it is devastatingly lethal. Because it deposits all its energy in a very short distance, it acts like microscopic cannonballs, ripping through cells and shattering DNA with brutal efficiency. To confirm their suspicion, the Aldermaston scientists had to perform a more complex analysis. They prepared a new sample of the urine and placed it in a device called an alpha spectrometer. The result that came back was stunning. It showed a clear, unambiguous energy spike at precisely 5.3 megaelectron volts. This was the unique, undeniable fingerprint of a specific isotope, polonium-210. The mystery was solved. The ghost had a name. Polonium-210 is one of the rarest and most toxic substances on Earth. It is a naturally occurring element, but only in infinitesimal quantities. The amount needed for a lethal dose is almost invisible to the naked eye, a speck smaller than a grain of salt. To be produced in the quantity used to kill Litvinenko, it must be manufactured inside a nuclear reactor by bombarding an isotope of bismuth with neutrons. This is a process available to only a handful of nations with advanced nuclear capabilities. Russia is one of them. It was, in every sense of the word, a nuclear weapon, miniaturized to fit inside a teacup. The choice of polonium-210 was diabolical in its cleverness. It is easy to transport across borders because its alpha radiation cannot be detected by standard airport security scanners. It is lethal in microscopic amounts. And until the scientists at Aldermaston made their breakthrough, it was medically untraceable. The assassins had every reason to believe their crime would never be solved. They had chosen the perfect weapon. By the time the poison was identified, it was too late. On November 23, 2006, 22 days after sipping from a poisoned cup of tea, Alexander Litvinenko's heart finally gave out. He was 44 years old. But before he died, with the last of his strength, he made sure the world would hear his story. Knowing his death was imminent, he dictated a final statement to his friend, Alex Goldfarb, from his bed in the intensive care unit. The photograph taken of him in his final days is haunting. It shows a man aged decades in a matter of weeks, gaunt, jaundiced, and completely bald, a specter staring out from his hospital bed. But his eyes still held a spark of defiance. His final message was a direct and searing indictment of the man he held responsible. The statement was released to the media shortly after his death. It reads, in part, "I may be able to silence one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life. May God forgive you for what you have done, not only to me, but to beloved Russia and its people." He went on to thank the British government for taking him in, and the doctors and nurses who had fought so hard to save him. The statement was a masterstroke, a final act of defiance that transformed his murder from a clandestine assassination into a global political event. He had used his own death to point a finger directly at the pinnacle of power in the Kremlin. He had ensured that his assassins could kill his body, but not his voice. His deathbed accusation set the stage for one of the most complex and politically charged murder investigations in modern history. The hunt for his killers was now a hunt for the truth behind a state-sponsored nuclear attack. The discovery of polonium-210 triggered an immediate and massive public health emergency. The substance was not just a poison. It was a contaminant. Every place Litvinenko had been, every object he had touched after being poisoned, was now a potential radiation hazard. Scotland Yard's Counter-Terrorism Command, SO-15, took charge of the investigation, codenamed Operation Pycea. Their task was twofold: to track down the killers and to trace the radioactive trail they had left behind before more people were harmed. It was a forensic challenge of unprecedented scale and complexity. Teams in full hazmat suits, equipped with specialized alpha particle detectors, began the painstaking process of retracing Litvinenko's final steps. The scope of the contamination was staggering. Polonium was found at the Itsu sushi restaurant where he'd met Mario Scaramella. It was found at the office of Boris Berezovsky, which Litvinenko had visited. It was found in his home in Muswell Hill, particularly in the bathroom where he had been violently ill. It was a trail of invisible breadcrumbs scattered across London. The epicenter of the investigation, however, was the Millennium Hotel. The teams descended on the Pine Bar. Their detectors lit up. The polonium was everywhere. It was on the table where the men had sat. It was on the chairs. But the highest reading, the radioactive ground zero, came from a single teapot. It contained a massive concentration of polonium-210, far more than was needed for a single lethal dose. This suggested either extreme carelessness on the part of the assassins or a chilling indifference to the potential for collateral damage. The investigation expanded. The police now had their primary suspects. The two men Litvinenko had met for tea, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. Where had they been? The detectives began to track their movements with the same meticulous, radiation-focused lens. They discovered that the two men had stayed at several hotels during their trips to London. The investigators followed the trail to the Best Western Hotel where Kovtun had stayed on a previous trip in October, and to the Parks Hotel where Lugovoy had stayed. Both rooms showed traces of polonium contamination, but the most significant find was at the Sheraton Park Lane Hotel, where Lugovoy had stayed just before the meeting on November 1st. In the bin of his room, number 848, investigators found a residue with an astronomical polonium reading, suggesting this may have been where the poison was handled or even spilt. The trail wasn't confined to hotels. The radioactive signature was found on the Emirates Stadium seats where Lugovoy had watched a CSKA Moscow football match. It was found in a strip club that Kovtun had visited. The men were walking radioactive clouds, leaving a trail of poison wherever they went. They seemed to have made little or no effort to contain the deadly substance they were carrying. This trail of contamination became the prosecution's key forensic evidence, a radioactive fingerprint that linked Lugovoy and Kovtun directly to the poison and followed their every move. The investigation then went global. The forensic trail led to the airplanes that the two men had used to travel between Moscow and London. British Airways was forced to ground 3 of its Boeing 767 jets. Health authorities undertook the mammoth task of contacting over 30,000 passengers who had flown on those planes after the assassins. Ultimately, hundreds of people, including hotel staff, passengers, and police officers, were found to have been exposed to low levels of polonium-210. While the doses were too small to cause immediate illness, the long-term cancer risk for some was elevated. The assassins had not just killed one man. They had conducted a radiological attack in the heart of a major city, showing a reckless disregard for the lives of thousands of innocent civilians. The investigation painted a damning picture. It suggested that Lugovoy and Kovtun had brought the polonium from Moscow and had likely made at least one prior attempt to administer it to Litvinenko, possibly during an earlier meeting in mid-October. The final, successful attempt was the tea at the Pine Bar on November 1st. Every piece of forensic evidence pointed to these two men as the executors of the plot. So who were Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun? They were not common criminals. Like Litvinenko, they were products of the Soviet security apparatus. Lugovoy was a former KGB officer who had served in the prestigious 9th Directorate, responsible for guarding top Kremlin officials. After leaving the service, he entered the lucrative world of private security, providing services for Russian oligarchs and businessmen. Kovtun was a former officer in the Soviet army. They were insiders, men who understood the tradecraft of the intelligence world. After Litvinenko's death, both men flew back to Moscow, where they publicly and vociferously proclaimed their innocence. They claimed that they too were victims, somehow contaminated by Litvinenko himself, they held press conferences, portraying themselves as legitimate businessmen caught up in a complex political conspiracy orchestrated by the enemies of Russia. Lugovoy even claimed that British intelligence had tried to recruit him to spy on Russia. Their denials, however, were contradicted by the overwhelming forensic evidence. The radioactive trail began with them in Moscow and ended with them in Moscow. The highest concentrations of polonium were found in the places they controlled, their hotel rooms and the teapot they served. The contamination trail left by Litvinenko only began after he met with them. The logic was inescapable. The British Crown Prosecution Service certainly thought so. In May 2007, they announced that they had sufficient evidence to charge Andrei Lugovoy with the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. Kovtun would be charged later, as more evidence against him solidified. The British Foreign Office formally submitted an extradition request to Moscow for Lugovoy to stand trial in the UK. The request was not just a legal document, it was a diplomatic challenge. The British government was accusing a former officer of the Russian state security services of carrying out a nuclear assassination on their soil and was demanding that Russia hand him over for justice. The Russian response was swift and absolute. They refused, citing Article 61 of the Russian Constitution, which prohibits the extradition of Russian citizens to foreign states. The Prosecutor General's office flatly rejected the request. It was a legal stone wall that everyone knew was political. The refusal triggered a severe diplomatic crisis. The UK expelled 4 Russian diplomats. In a tit-for-tat response, Russia expelled 4 British diplomats. Relations between the two countries plunged into a deep freeze, not seen since the Cold War. Andrei Lugovoy, far from being a pariah, was hailed as a patriot in Russia. He was given a seat in the Duma, the Russian parliament, as a member of a nationalist party, a position that granted him legal immunity from prosecution. He became a television personality, a symbol of defiance against the West. Both he and Kovtun continued to live freely, protected by the state that the British government was now convinced had sent them to kill. The criminal case had hit a dead end. Justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible. Lugovoy and Kovtun would never face a British jury. But the story was not over. If criminal justice was unattainable, another form of justice, a public accounting of the truth, was still possible. For years, Marina Litvinenko, Alexander's widow, campaigned relentlessly for a full public inquiry into his death. A criminal trial was impossible without the defendants, but a public inquiry had a different purpose. It would not result in a conviction, but it could examine all the evidence, including sensitive intelligence material, that couldn't be used in a regular court, and make a definitive judgment about who was responsible. The British government was initially reluctant, wary of further damaging relations with Russia. But Marina's persistence, combined with a high court ruling in her favor, eventually forced their hand. In 2014, the Home Secretary announced that a public inquiry would be held, chaired by a senior judge, Sir Robert Owen. The inquiry began in January 2015. It was a monumental undertaking, hearing from dozens of witnesses and examining thousands of pages of evidence. For the first time, the full, chilling narrative of the assassination was laid out for the world to see. The inquiry meticulously reconstructed the plot. It heard evidence that Kovtun had been actively seeking a cook in London who would be willing to administer a very expensive poison to a very bad man. It examined the complex radioactive trail in forensic detail. It heard from experts who testified that the polonium-210 used could only have come from a state-run nuclear facility. The evidence presented was overwhelming. In January 2016, Sir Robert Owen published his final report. Its conclusions were explosive and unambiguous. He found that Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun had indeed poisoned Alexander Litvinenko by deliberately administering polonium-210 to him in the Pine Bar. He dismissed their claims of innocence as undoubtedly untrue, but the report went much further. Sir Robert concluded that the assassination was not a rogue operation or a business dispute gone wrong. It was an act of the Russian state. He wrote that the FSB operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the FSB at the time. Then came the final, devastating conclusion. Taking into account all the evidence and analysis available to him, Sir Robert found that the operation was probably approved by President Putin. The chain of command, he concluded, led all the way to the top. The report laid out several possible motives. That Litvinenko was targeted for his work for British intelligence, as retaliation for his relentless public criticism of the FSB and Putin, or as a message to other dissidents that no one anywhere was beyond the Kremlin's reach. The inquiry's finding was a landmark moment. It was a formal, judicial statement from a British judge, based on an exhaustive review of the evidence, that the President of Russia had likely ordered a nuclear assassination on the streets of London. The Russian government dismissed the report as a whitewash and politically motivated. But for Marina Litvinenko and for the world, it was the closest thing to justice they were ever likely to get. Dmitry Kovtun died in Moscow in 2022 from complications of COVID-19, having never faced trial. Andrei Lugovoy remains a member of the Russian Duma to this day, a protected man, a living symbol of the brazen impunity of the act. So we return to our central theme, the anatomy of this unique and terrible crime. What sets the murder of Alexander Litvinenko apart is not just the who or the why, but the how. The use of polonium-210 was a calculated choice, a decision that speaks volumes about the nature of the state that deployed it. It was chosen for its stealth, its lethality, and its obscurity. The assassins believed it would be untraceable, allowing them to kill a man and melt away, leaving behind only a baffling medical mystery. It was an act of supreme confidence, a belief that they could operate beyond the reach of Western science and law. But in this, they miscalculated. They underestimated the tenacity of the victim, the dedication of the doctors, the brilliance of the scientists at Aldermaston, and the meticulous professionalism of Scotland Yard. The very exoticism of the weapon, designed to ensure anonymity, became its undoing. Once identified, its state-sponsored origin was undeniable. No criminal gang or private individual could have obtained it. The poison itself was the signature of the state. The assassination was more than a murder. It was a message. Its brutal, slow, and agonizing method was a form of psychological warfare. The 22-day public decline of Alexander Litvinenko served as a gruesome spectacle, a warning to other defectors, journalists, and critics of the Kremlin. It demonstrated that there was no safe harbor, that dissent carried a terrible price, and that the state had a long memory and an even longer reach. It was an act of nuclear terrorism, blurring the lines between intelligence operations and acts of war. It violated fundamental international norms, treating the streets of a foreign capital as a permissible battlefield. The legacy of this case is profound. It revealed the ruthless nature of modern authoritarianism and its willingness to deploy weapons of mass destruction against its own citizens on foreign soil. It exposed the limitations of international law in the face of a powerful nation determined to shield its agents from justice. The case of Alexander Litvinenko stands as a chilling monument to our time, a story of betrayal, courage, and a crime so audacious it almost defies belief. The radioactive trail has long since faded, but the political fallout continues to radiate, a toxic legacy of a single poisoned cup of tea. The poison was invisible, but the message was not, that the arm of the Kremlin is long, and its memory is absolute. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.